Well now, it is a big day for live-action remakes as the very first DreamWorks reboot has come out a few days early in the UK in the form of How to Train Your Dragon 1. And it's a very interesting case study for a whole host of reasons that I wouldn't be surprised has the animation industry holding their breath to see which direction this goes, right as we're coming to a public consensus that Disney remakes are kinda dying. Is this a meteoric new spin in the DreamWorks method? Or is this just more of the same, equally falling flat in quality, much to the likes of the recent Lilo and Stitch film? Because the thing that really brings this project apart, especially when you see the marketing behind the trailers, is this is very much a safer, more shot-to-shot approach than the Disney method of keeping half the movie and then spinning off in their own direction. There are a lot of things that make the How to Train Your Dragon remake stand out from its usual live-action cousins, because not only is it not a Disney project, it's not a musical and instead leaning more on a real drama, which I guess you could say is very Stitch-inspired too, but also one of the real core changes, or I guess not changes in this case, is the fact that they brought on the same director again. This isn't an example of taking a Disney movie that's 60, 80 years old and then bringing in a new wave of writers to repurpose it. No, this is very much just a kind of director's cut. An opportunity for the core team to make little tweaks and polishes to change the story if they must, but otherwise ensuring that the integrity and the magic of that initial movie is still held on. And I gotta say, when it comes to this specific example, they're running with the theme of if it's not broke, don't fix it. And yeah, I would probably go on to say this is probably the best live-action remake yet. It's an interesting one though, because at the end of the day, this is mostly shot for shot. It's not exactly the same. Every scene is a little bit different with the wordings, maybe they cut things a little bit earlier, and of course the directing is completely different now that it's grounded in live-action physics. But the fact of the matter is, How to Train Your Dragon is one of DreamWorks' very best films ever, and if you just copy and paste it again, yeah, it's gonna, be better than some DreamWorks schlop. I think it's very ironic that the latest Disney remake is actually in the example of Lilo and Stitch, because this is definitively just the opposite ethos. Sure, they might both not be musicals, but where Lilo and Stitch had hints of emotional leanings in the relationship between Lilo and Stitch, for example, what How to Train Your Dragon does really, really well is focusing so much on the relationships between Hiccup and Stoic. One of the things that really stands out against all the Disney reboots that we've seen is that DreamWorks actually allows their actors to act. And the casting of Gerard Butler again as Stoic is so immaculately done. The high highs have this great, cartoony, loud Viking voice, but then they are more than happy to lean into the sadder, more somber elements of the character that I guess just aren't really visible in any Disney movie. You don't have a character as grand as Stoic and an actor that then follows through in those footsteps as well as anything else we've seen. And having this film be such a drama with comedic elements, sure, allows you to really feel the artsiness behind this to make it feel more like cinema than just a movie, And beyond just the acting highlights that are there, visually, they really lean into making this not just a live-action repasting, but trying to make the best photorealistic visuals that are available. Not only in just making the dragons now have less cartoony designs and more photorealistic scary eyes, but there's so many scenes that I adore for the lighting effect of all things. There are so many moments when we get the full footage of the film, you'll get to see it properly, but so many scenes are just cast in silhouettes and backlighting. So many scenes have Stoic angrily talking to his son, and all you see is just the shape of his shoulders and his horns against this beaming sunlight coming through the door. That's cinema. That is art. It is not being lost in this plastered down, sanded copy and paste job. It's just an adaptation that holds on to making this as magical as the first, or at least trying a damn good job. There are, of course, limitations when it comes to the animation. You can't do crazy things that you could do in animation, whilst at the same time, How to Train Your Dragon's fairly grounded anything that is fantastical is done on dragons that are still CGI dragons, so they can do whatever they want. And the humans, yeah, they can still do their flips. I think it's enticing enough. If anything, having the humans look less able because they are bound by real-life physics only makes their challenge against fighting dragons and the big megalomaniac-sized one at the end all the more impressive and high stakes because they are limited in what they can do. It's a really beautiful balance. I think it's just because the prompt is just the best it could be in this being the story they adapt, against all the Disney musicals that have to sort of lean into the sort of campy musical tone half the time, and it doesn't translate, and also a musical number in general has far more opportunities in animated form. You know, any sort of genie song from Aladdin, you could do anything when it's 2D or even 3D. The moment you make him human, it just gets, you know, underwhelming. And I would definitely not describe this movie as underwhelming. Wherever it can, it leans into making sure you feel the moments. And there are loads of tiny movie techniques in there. Obviously, you've got the camera work when we're riding on the back of Toothless and it's going to be a little bit shaky and all the rest of it. They have this great sound design with the Night Fury, of course, that they brought over from the original, but it just sort of works. And considering there is, as I understand it, a lot of real-world visual effects planted in there, every time a dragon breathes fire, it just is magical eye candy. It's as best as you could do in the glass box that is a live-action remake. Of course, that's not to say this is necessarily a 10 out of 10 movie. There is still plenty of room for complaints, but it's a far shorter list than Lilo and Stitch. They haven't changed absolutely everything in the story and replaced it with schmuck. Most of the highlights you would want to see in this movie from the original, they've kept. You might have lost a line like, trolls will steal your socks, but only the left ones. Oh, what a shame. But also, if I was to mention some criticisms, naturally, a good chunk of the delivery is just not as good as a voice-acted performance. I would actually probably say my biggest, largest, slightly debatable complaint is that the new Hiccup is not as good as the original Hiccup. They are visually, of course, completely different with the age bracket, but also Hiccup in the original had a voice, an accent, a really dorky tone. This guy, he's muted, he's normal, he's fine. You do kind of roll into it after a while. They seem to find their spin, and they do have, you know, emotional, you know, they can act, sure, but when you compare it to the original Hiccup, that's always going to be a little bit lost. There is actually, if anything, a lot of delivery complaints I have where lines we've heard before don't quite work as well in live action when you see it. Sometimes it's the comedic timing. When we initially covered some of the trailers for this movie, I mentioned specifically the line, oh look, it's as big as my, and then the tiny dragon jumps on their face. The timing was just slicker in animation, whereas in live action, it sounded like they were just saying the line, because that's where they say the line, and then they waited for some reason, and then did the motion. It just comedically wasn't as slick in that case. And in other formats, you have the problem of just slightly different directing in the scene that makes it a little bit less impactful. One of the best highlights, we're going to talk spoilers for the whole movie, by the way, just so you're aware. I assume you've seen the original, so you know how this remake goes. Take, for example, the best moment from Gobber, where he's fighting in the final battle alongside Stoic, and he's like, Stoic's like, leave me be, you know, I can give you 6 minutes. And then Gobber's like, don't worry, I can double that time. And they choose to stay in it. That is the best moment for that character for me. And in this remake, they say it while turning over like some sort of catapult or something. But also, the camera's pulled away, and they say it while they're grunting and pushing this thing. And I guess it's just like the sound design keeps it like a conversation in the background of the battle. And it's like not leaning into the emotive beat that scene is, and it happens a fair bit. A lot of these iconic lines are kind of background lines, or they're sort of lost in the smorgasbord of fiery dragon sounds the whole time that I sometimes couldn't hear or couldn't feel as strongly as I could feel in the original. It didn't help as well, actually, in my personal viewing. The cinema lights stayed on and blared onto the screen during the first 5 minutes, so the whole opening could not see a thing. There was just bright orangey green lights, literally in like one of the darkest scenes in the movie. Couldn't see anything. There's a lovely line where Hiccup's like, oh, it's not much for the view. And I'm like, yeah, you're damn right. The whole thing looks like piss water. Typical that's probably one of the best visual scenes that really hooks you in. And I specifically showed up early so I wouldn't miss it. And then I missed it anyway. They didn't replay the movie. Big shame there. Not the movie's fault. Hey there, you made it to the halfway mark of this video. You know how it goes at this point. Come subscribe if you're interested in more movie reviews. We're going to be doing Pixar's Elio soon, and every other movie that comes out this year. The Smurfs, maybe K-pop Demon Hunters. I'm sure there's another SpongeBob movie coming out around Christmas, probably. So come join if you haven't already. And let's get over to the second half of How to Train Your Dragon Remake. Cheers! Now, of course, it's typical for me to come here and say a live-action remake that just copy and pastes closer to the source material makes it the best version of a live-action remake is in itself perhaps leaning into a more lazy style of movie production going forwards, and I'm aware of that. I'm sort of 50-50 on the idea of, do I like this, or is it even worth reposting a movie at all just because it's in a different genre, you know? Is this a similar thing of Disney just repainting over animation, as if live action is a superior form of cinema? And it's interesting. I remember a conversation I had back in like 2019 talking about one of the King Kong versus Godzilla movies, where this normal guy basically said to me, well, he said it in slightly less polite words, but we'll water it down a bit. He basically said, I really don't care about the narrative in a Kong versus Godzilla movie. Any monster movie, I have no interest in knowing about the narrative. I just want to see a very big monster punch another very big monster, and I'm happy. If it's a monster movie, I'm gonna sit back, eat some popcorn, be entertained by the visuals, and see some cinema. And that's about it. And I think, oddly enough, specifically with the prompt of How to Train Your Dragon, it leans into that element as well. This is, even if you take away the narrative originalities, because it's not very original, it's just a copy and paste job with some, polishes around the side. This is, in essence, just movie entertainment. It is a lot of monster madness. You want to see the dragons do some things? The dragons do some damn things in this movie, and the narrative can be a nice little bonus on the side, and I think it kind of very well leans into that even though it's not that spectacularly original, you can just sit back and enjoy it regardless of how lax it arguably is. But also you can't help but notice that they're putting in as much effort to make every shot as magical and artsy as it can, whether it takes directly from the source material or adapts it visually as best it can in the medium. I think it just finds that balance immaculately well, or maybe the bar's just so low after Lilo and Stitch being one of Disney's worst. If anything, this feels like a sort of director's cut of the movie as well. The changes that are in there are just little polishes and tweaks that the director wanted. One of the big complaints that I heard online was the inclusion of a more diverse cast, but they actually find a way to narratively explain it in a way that I think really works nicely. For a start, this is a piece of fiction. We don't need to go into the historical accuracies of all Vikings have to be specific. Let stories be stories. And in this case, they run with the idea that there were multiple tribes of Vikings that have now all conglomerated together to the nearest point of a giant dragon's nest in order to have more people involved and be able to see themselves in this fictional land where dragons suddenly exist. I think that's really nicely done, and I have no complaints whatsoever with that. And with those little changes they made, they absolutely do not overwrite anything from the original. The full movie is 2 hours and 5 minutes, which is the whole length of the original movie, plus an extra 27 minutes on top. So it's very much just, here's all the scenes you love, and then a little bit of extra on top. Even then, I don't know what that was. Every scene's just embellished more, and nothing at all gets replaced. And by doing that, the magic just stays there. That being said, one element of the multicultural addition they've added with the cast that I'm a little bit on is, unfortunately enough, Nick Frost. Love that he's playing the role of Gobber. It sucks that his accent disappeared, though. Instead of having this iconic Scottish accent along the side with brilliant delivery of these iconic lines, you have Nick Frost being British. And that's fine, it's different. Is he from a different tribe, or did he live with Stoic and just ended up with a different voice? I don't know. But it made him feel a bit more like he was just a little bit Nick Frost with a different look, and a lot of his lines just felt flatter. Maybe it's one of those things that would grow on me if I watched it more and more, but when you compare it to the voice acting performance of Gobber of the original, That was probably one of the biggest losses and most notable changes, which is saying something because that's not really a massive change in the grand scheme of where it could have been. But when it comes to the rest of the cast, I bloody well love them. I think the actor of Astrid did an absolutely fantastic job in their role, and I enjoy the addition that she's like, I've come from nothing from her tribe and pushing for that chief role. You've got Snotlout getting a nice little expansion with his dad as a character involved. There's a lot of, that's my son vibes running with this movie, but I guess that makes sense, as father and son relationship is at the core of this movie anyway. But I really like their addition. It's kind of the same, just archetype as Flash from the Spider-Man movies, so you can sort of see where some of those cliches come in, but it's very entertaining. And I think everyone was able to really flesh out their characters and stand out and get the tone they were selling. And yeah, it made them all very likable in their own little way. There's also nice micro little changes to some of the character motivations, like Hiccup actually being disliked not just for being a screw-up, but for being kind of a nepo baby. He's the son of the chief who's not been excluded from the island for all of his screw-ups. That's interesting, and maybe a slight modernization of, we dislike nepo babies, let's get that into the movie. I don't know, who knows, maybe. Beyond that, there's little hints that feel like ad-libbing. I'm not even sure if they are. They might be well scripted, but there's little sort of ad-lippy delivery that I really enjoy. That's just like nice little tongue-in-cheek elbow points, and I enjoy those. Same as a couple shots that looked like they might have been bloopers, but they ran with it anyway. A couple stumbles and a cup goes flying and they just kept it in. I love that stuff. Sometimes when you got a movie that really doesn't change much, it's the little moments that can really sort of tickle you. And beyond that, the only other real change I noticed was slight changes in lines for a different purpose. Maybe it's a more debatable one, but when Hiccup is about to fight against their training final dragon, they instead turn to Astrid and say, don't get involved, instead of don't let them take Toothless, making it more of a romance chemistry line rather than a pragmatic here's looking to the future line. I didn't mind it. I think it was fine. I've heard a little bit more of an argument of that kind of ruins the sort of stance that Hiccup has in that moment. It's micro stuff in an otherwise stellar movie. On one end, it's just simple entertainment movie stuff. You want to see live action dragons? Here's some live action dragons. It's Game of Thrones for kids. And maybe that makes it the normie version of animated movies that conceptually kind of sucks if a family only chooses to watch a live action version as if it's a more superior form of cinema. On the other side of things, while it is repurposing a story, it's doing so in a new genre as best as it can. You've got practical effects, artsy cinematography, and fantastic stellar acting performances that are allowed to breathe and really lean into what it means to be doing this acting theatre job. This feels like a remake that takes on as much respect as possible to the source material, which makes sense because it's the same guy directing it. It's not just a slap-over redo to make more money off of something they've already made, and it doesn't feel quite so corporate. So is it worth watching on its own without seeing the original? Yeah, I would say so. It stands as its own well-done version of the same story, even if I personally would always want people to see the animated version first and then compare the two and talk about cinema. But hey, this is my hyperfixation, so I would say that. If we were to say that the original How to Train Your Dragon movie is a 9 out of 10, then this movie, I would argue, is probably simply an 8 out of 10. I think this movie would always be one marker down, maybe two, since it's slightly more limited compared to animation. And some of the sound design work just felt not as impactful as that original movie. But when it comes to the cage that is a live-action remaking concept, I think this is about as good as you can make it. Sure, I'd love for the visuals to be a little bit more cartoony, maybe a little more saturation in places, although I did find out that the costume designs of the first movie were pretty brown and green anyway. But still, I wouldn't mind if it looked a little bit more visually better than photorealistic. But overall, for sure, this movie is leaps and bounds ahead of every Disney live-action remake we've ever seen. Considering the very first Disney remakes were kind of people's favorites, maybe it makes sense that the very first of DreamWorks' remakes are similarly possibly leaning to be people's favorites. Now the question really is, what does this mean for the future of DreamWorks and the animation industry? I could very well see, if my opinion is the norm, that this will bring a new renaissance of live-action remakes, but hopefully in the artsy, more holding on to integrity vibe that this movie has. There will almost certainly be sequels if this is anywhere close to successful, and thinking about what other DreamWorks movies could be live action, I kinda shudder to think, don't give me Kung Fu Panda or Boss Baby. God, both of those sound absolutely terrible. Or who knows, maybe some other animation studio will take a piece of that pie now that it's opened the floodgates for another studio. Either way, reluctant as I may be from my initial thoughts from the trailer, this was a damn good movie experience. It was mostly shot for shot, it was relatively safe, but Gerard Butler stole the show, and I can't not say that it was chock full of brilliant eye candy throughout. For now, my name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this review. Do tell me your thoughts of the How to Train Your Dragon remake when you do get around to seeing it. I'm a little early over here in the UK, but I'd love to hear your thoughts when you do, and I shall see you all in a little bit. Cheerio!